Hey everyone, welcome everyone. This is Race and the Movement Forward. Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Leah Obias. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy and Strategy at Race Forward. So welcome again to the 450 plus participants that registered for today's webinar. And for those who are joining via Facebook Live, thank you to everyone for joining us on our multiple channels today. Today's webinar is called Race and the Movement Forward, Organizing for Racial Justice After the Inauguration. This is the third and final of a three-part webinar series focused on organizing around the historic 2020 election. The first, Race and the Vote, in October, looked at grassroots organizing for voter turnout and voter suppression among communities of color, as well as the necessity of continued organizing beyond the elections. The second panel in January discussed expanding on the momentum of that organizing and explored strategies to sustain a strong movement for racial justice. And today, we're super excited. We're going to hear from organizers who are leading for policy change to advance racial justice at the federal level. So I want to start by acknowledging that though we're gathered virtually, we're on stolen, occupied land. The United States is founded upon racial hierarchy, stolen indigenous lands, and broken treaties with indigenous nations, and domination over native peoples all over Turtle Island. Today, I live and work on the lands of the Lenape and Canarsie people in what is colonially known as Brooklyn, New York. Native people and communities continue to survive, thrive, and organize. And it is our responsibility to figure out how we can support the organizing happening in our local communities. And we encourage people to name the land that they're currently occupying. You can find the link in the chat to find the territory that you are on. So we encourage people to do that. The link should pop up in a moment. So a few logistical notes. Everyone on Zoom is currently on mute and off camera, but you can message the panelists in the chat in case they're having technical difficulties, and my colleagues will help you. You can send your questions via the Q&A button, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and our staff will help sort through your questions and consolidate them so we can answer as many as we can during the Q&A section of the webinar. We have ASL interpreters with us today to help make our webinar as inclusive as possible, and we also have live captioning. If you'd like to enable live captioning, you can go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click live transcript and click enable. And I'm seeing people coming up in the chat with their the land that they're on, so thank you. Deep gratitude to our accessibility team, Rory, Antonio, and Lindsay. Thank you so much for being with us today, ensuring that our webinar is accessible. And deep gratitude to Race Forward's webinar team and communications team who have made this event a reality today. So before we begin our panel discussion, I wanted to provide some brief background on Race Forward and the series. Race Forward is a national racial justice organization that catalyzes movement building for racial justice. In partnership with communities, organizations, and sectors, we build strategies to advance racial justice in our policies, institutions, and culture. The Race and webinars were launched as a series of virtual panels and talks in 2020 to examine the role of race in key issues facing communities of color. We use a race and framework because it allows us to be explicit about race and to deepen our conversations and strategies in the intersections. This framework is not new. You might have heard it before in the form of intersectionality, which is a term coined in 1989 by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. And as it is March and Women's Month and International Women's Day in a few days, we want to recognize that our race and framing goes even farther back thanks to the intellectual labor of Black women across centuries. Sojourner Truth, A famous abolitionist born into slavery gave her famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, in 1851 at a women's rights convention in Ohio. This was at the time when women were fighting for equal rights with men. And of course, this early wave of feminism did not include Black women. Ain't I a Woman is Sojourner's exclamation that inside her were many identities as a Black woman. And that when we're talking about equal rights for women, they actually just meant white women at the time, and that she would not receive the same benefits of feminism because of racism. Sojourner Truth exposed the contradictions of the gender system once you put race into the mix. The Movement for Black Lives is celebrating Black Feminisms Month to acknowledge Black, queer, and trans feminist perspectives. We encourage you to follow them as they uplift the work of Black feminist literary and organizing leaders throughout the month of March. The transnational feminist organization, Affirm, which is also represented on this panel, will be featuring campaigns uplifting women's struggles this month as well, so we encourage you to follow Affirm. So with these frameworks in mind, and to set the political context, the inauguration and the first several weeks of the Biden administration are behind us. We know Biden was elected due to the powerful organizing work of communities of color, Black women especially, who more than anything wanted to vote 45 out. And we know that the organizing work is continuing, of course, and must continue because the changes we need to make around healthcare, housing, voting rights, climate, indigenous sovereignty, and so many issues are still desperately needed. On January 14, President Biden introduced an ambitious agenda for his administration's first 100 days, including a proposal for a $1.9 trillion package to address the COVID-19 crisis and the wounded economy. And the first 100 days agenda calls to protect voting rights, reform criminal justice, action around climate, and a pathway to citizenship for the country's more than 11 million undocumented immigrants. All of these are legislative acts with great significance to people of color. And about a month and a half later, our panelists are going to give us a perspective on how the administration is doing on some key planks of that agenda. Among his first actions, Biden issued a flurry of executive orders, more than FDR's first month, who previously held the record for executive orders, and many reversed some of the previous administration's damaging policies, those included disbanding the 1776 Commission, which was historically inaccurate, especially around the institution of slavery, ending the horrific and the racist Muslim ban, canceling Keystone XL, and reversing policies around opening national monuments like Bears Ears and Gwen Staircase. And some of these, I mean, all of them really, but the executive orders do warrant a deeper look, like, for example, funding for the wall, ending funding for the wall is positive, but that funding actually came from Pentagon excess. It didn't actually go to social services where it should be directed, but rather stayed in the Pentagon. The executive order on halting any further private prisons was also positive. But note that these are Department of Justice prisons. They don't include immigrant detention facilities, which are actually housing the main populations of those who are imprisoned by private prisons. And what he hasn't done that he promised, canceling student debt, the $15 minimum wage, which is a huge battle right now, and the moratorium on detentions that was recently rolled back. And in fact, an estimated 26,000 people have already been deported by this administration so far. Meanwhile, we know that the opposition is working hard to roll back progress that our movements have made. On Monday, the Georgia House of Representatives approved this election overhaul bill that would place new voter ID requirements on absentee ballots and limit weekend voting, which would have devastating impacts on the voting rights of Black, brown, and poor people. So there's a lot of work to be done. And today we're going to focus on policy change as a central strategy for racial and social justice. And we view policy as a means to build power and win material changes for the lives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC communities. Policy is a concrete expression of the values of our movements, and they represent key battlegrounds with those who oppose racial, economic, and gender justice. One thing that was revealed in 2020, and especially January 6th, was not just how alive and well white supremacy is in this country, but also how organized our opposition is. So I'm excited to hear the conversation with our powerful speakers today who are going to help us understand the policy landscape and how we can take advantage of this moment to push towards transformational change. They're going to talk about campaigns and policy demands from a movement and an organizing perspective. With the vast array of racial justice policy fights happening across the country, they're going to focus on just a few of the issues that had historic significance in 2020 and continue to shape the lives of our communities today. That includes racist policing, immigrant detention and deportation, and healthcare and COVID. So we're joined by Ramaya Davis, who's a student organizer with the DC Girls Coalition and our first young person to be featured on a race and panel. Dr. Amara Enyia, the policy and research coordinator for the Movement for Black Lives. Connie Huynh, Healthcare for All campaign director with People's Action and the national chairperson of Affirm, and Alejandra Pablos of the Keep Ale Free campaign. So at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jewel Stewart, to moderate the conversation. And at this point, I'll ask the panelists to go on camera.
Thank you so much, Leah. And it's such a pleasure to have everyone here. My name is Jewel Stewart, and I'm the Policy Research Manager here at Race Forward. And as Leah said, I'll be moderating today's amazing panel. Welcome to our panelists and to everyone in the audience joining us today, both on Zoom and on Facebook Live, and anybody who accesses this recording after this live presentation. So I would like to turn to our panelists right now and give them a chance to introduce themselves. So please let the audience know who you are, including your name, your pronouns, and where you're joining us from, and also, of course, what organization or campaign you're here to represent. And I'll start with Ramaya.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ramaya Davis. I'm from Washington, D.C. I work with Pathways to Power, United Leaders for Freedom, and the DC Girls Coalition. Today, I will be talking about my ideas from my perspective of capitalism and also police-free school campaign. Something small I would mention about that I'm working on. I'm currently working on a big venture to develop a African and African American history curriculum that can be implemented across the U.S. By law, not just like by school district or Pacific schools. Thank you. Oh,
thanks for
got my pronouns. My pronouns are she, her, revolutionary. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today, and I will go to our panelist, Amara, next.
Hello, everyone. Amara Enyia, she, her. I am tuning in to this event from Chicago, which is Potawatomi land. And it's really a pleasure to be a part of this conversation today. I'm representing the Movement for Black Lives, where I serve as the Policy and Research Coordinator, and we'll be talking about our work with the Breathe Act and around issues of criminal justice reform, investment in communities, and what that looks like moving forward. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Great, it's a pleasure to have you here. And Connie, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Connie Huynh, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm joining you from occupied Tongva territory, also known as Los Angeles. And I'm actually here representing two organizations, People's Action, which is a national network of state and local grassroots power building organizations, united in fighting for justice. I'm the Healthcare for All campaign director here, where I have the privilege of working with many grassroots organizations fighting for change at all levels of government to win a just healthcare system. We're helping to lead the national movement to win Medicare for all and to end vaccine racism and nationalism in the COVID pandemic. I am also the national chairperson of Affirm, which is an all-volunteer transnational feminist organization led by Black, Indigenous, and immigrant women of color building a feminist future. And we have a unique contribution in COVID, which is Kanlungan, which is a data wall and digital memorial for people who have fallen in the COVID pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. So it is a joy to be here with you all leading up to International Women's Day. Thank you.
Absolutely. And finally, our panelist, Alejandra.
What's up, everyone? Alejandra, my pronouns are she and hers. I'm out here in Arizona, Autumn lands, Yaqui lands. It's an honor to be here as well. Happy Women's History Month to everyone. Thank you for the invite. I think most importantly, I'll be sharing that policy that really impacts my own personal life currently. I've been fighting deportation for about 9 years. So I'll talk a lot about the work that we do, trying to make sure that we're, bringing dignity and humanizing people that have been criminalized for their immigration status. I'll be talking a lot about the New Way Forward legislation. It is a federal piece of legislation that the Immigrant Justice Network has been leading on, and it really centers on criminalized people and how labels and the way that the criminal justice has worked now, it's being distorted for like a double punishment for non-citizens. So I'll be talking about that legislation. I'll probably be talking a lot about legislation too, impacting immigrants for freedom of speech, a little bit about some of the campaigns that a lot of my, I don't represent particularly one organization, but I carry with me the resources and the relations from like a lot of the political homes that have like nurtured me. So I'll talk a lot about some of the campaigns that Mi Gente has, which is a Chicanx and Latinx digital organizing hub of organizers just challenging and uplifting and doing cultural work to really talk about the things that are impacting our communities. I'll be talking a lot about the Detention Watch Network, and again, the network of coalition work that we're doing at the Crimmigration intersection. And yeah, that's a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. And just to echo again, Leah's sentiments, we're so excited to have everyone here, so excited to have a conversation that's rooted in abolition and feminist values too, and organizing. So we're going to kick this off speaking to Ramaya. Ramaya, in our preliminary conversation, you shared that you're passionate about tackling systemic oppression, including dismantling capitalism as a root cause of the many of the poor living and working conditions of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. You also share with us that you're constantly reading and engaged in conversations to learn more about how to ground your organizing work in critiquing the status quo, which I don't know about other people who may be in my age range, but I'm really just so excited to hear that youth organizing is taking up this momentum as well. So can you share more about your vision for a just world, and specifically more about how your work with other student organizers to get police out of schools and to abolish the school to prison pipeline engages that vision?
Yes, I first like to talk about social class. So social stratification, institutionalized system of making categories of people in a hierarchy. So social class includes property, power, and prestige. Income is salary or wages from a job. Wealth is the value of all economic assets owned by a person or a family. So break it down into small statistics. 20% of wealthy families receive half of their income, while 20% of low-paid families receive only 3%. Income inequalities have been increasing since 1980. And there's 3 levels to poverty: is biological poverty, official poverty, and relative poverty. Biological poverty is to be understood as starvation and malnutrition, the deprivation of resources needed to sustain life. Official poverty is income level at which people are eligible for government benefits in the US, aka the poverty line. Relative poverty refers to people living below the standards of their society or group deprivation in relation to some cultural defined standard of need, and this can be compared to other places. Next, I'll talk about capitalism. Capitalism is a capitalism is a primary component. Natural resources and means of producing goods, services are privately owned. So the breakdown into three would be for capitalism would be private ownership of the means of production, market competition, pursuit of profit. Now I will connect to police-free schools, as I mentioned earlier in my introduction. The government's focus on controlling land and labor, usually using policy, using policing, having police in schools of color starts the early learning of someone else being in control of how you learn. How issues are addressed for the youth. Many interactions with police for students are because of social and emotional needs, but instead of dealing with those young people and controlled, the young people are controlled and forced to act in a certain way, which translates into how they will survive in the working class. So we need to move away from having police in schools because education is very important. One of the most valuable things you can have in life. And if you constantly are critiquing youth, especially youth of color, about certain circumstances they can't control because of how society has set them up to have, then you're just depriving them of their education. Their time to actually learn something, uh, understand what politics are and how, uh, sorry, how it's important to understand candidates and how when it's my time is coming soon to election. I everybody that's in my age group should know about politics enough to understand how to become a voter and vote when it's time to vote for another president. So this education can be developed the throughout our school years, as long as you don't keep us incarcerated or trying to put us into the school to prison pipeline. And I will leave it here. I have more, but I'll leave it here. Just checking on time due to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have a few more minutes. I love how you frame that, because it sounds to me like you're really interested in your organizing work revolves around an anti-capitalist framework that also calls on us to disinvest and divest from the police state and incarceration in order to invest more in our resources, our people, and our education. Would you say that? Do you think that do you think that resonates with you?
Yeah, I do. I didn't mention, since I do have like a minute or two, I could give you I love history. That's something I didn't mention in my intro, but I love history. So I could give you a little historical analysis about global capitalism during the 20th century. So around 1900 to 1980, government had been more involved in regulating economic affairs. That's called Fordism, and 1980s neoliberalism. The gov is less involved in regulating economic affairs, restriction, and trades. Maybe you can, for example, maybe you can think about Reagan's presidency. And after the 1980s, less restriction on trades, and then in the mid 1990s, economic relationships between U.S., Canada, and Mexico. They created lower labor costs, but quality products. So cheaper labor for quality products, underpaid workers to produce quality products for wealthy people.
So thanks for that history lesson. And I'm just wondering a little bit more about how grounding your work specifically in that anti-capitalist framework builds a more inclusive and sustainable movement for justice for a new generation of organizers and activists. Like, what do you think that you mentioned that you wanted your peers to also have this understanding? And, it seems like you're really well versed in history, and I see Fred Hampton behind. That's Fred Hampton, right? Behind you. And so you're, as a student of history and someone who was drawn to an anti-capitalist framework, how does that inspire you, and what do you think that your peers can learn from, can take away from that as you learn and be more politically engaged?
Okay. Thanks for the question. So Black Swan Academy is like the head of DC Girls Coalition and United Leagues for Freedom. So every month, like for a few, like maybe like 2 or 3, depending on the month, we hold Black Swan Academy hosts political education. So we have so anybody can join from that's youth from middle school age to at least 22 years old. So with that being said, that is an opportunity for us to understand more a variety of social issues that maybe our teachers in regular school has touched on, but can't spend that much time due to curriculum, and learn more about how they can shape their future career, of just getting some new ideas and thinking about the world, because I know for sure that youth around my age and even younger are curious about how different events that have occurred so far in our lifetime, why is it happening, how can we fix it, how can we help. And that's just that's a really good way that I have been involved in, to actually learning more about politics in general. Also, it's another reason why I'm in the process of developing an African and African American history curriculum, because in U.S. history, yes, we do talk about African Americans in the process of history, but it's not. I don't feel it's enough time. It's not enough time spent on learning about African Americans, the history of how we've been treated, in currently, in the past, and even like just the history of before we were captured and brought to the Americas. So I really think it's important. I also had the idea of making it inclusive, how African Americans interacted with different races, not different races besides white Americans. So those are 2 things I'm framing my work around, and I just really enjoy coming up with, like, thinking about this kind of stuff, and coming up with ideas and questions around the frameworks, to ask people that I am very familiar with, that I know is very familiar with these topics, or even just have a sense of history or direction they can turn me into, to help my thinking forward and process and creating my curriculum and doing other things for the society.
That's awesome, Ramaya. It's so cool to hear about that, because being a student of history is amazing, but also you're making history yourself. And, I think that it's really inspiring to me that there's so much learning going on among you and your peers. And then also I see, there's like lots of different platforms to engage with for youth right now. And so it's just really cool to see. Thank you. And we are out of time right now, but I appreciate you sharing, Ramaya, and I will move on to Amara. So last year, the Movement for Black Lives developed a revolutionary comprehensive bill called the BREATHE Act that establishes a framework to divest taxpayer funds from the carceral state and to invest in people. Can you tell us more about the BREATHE Act and how the Invest Divest framework elevates communities and builds on that kind of anti-capitalist framework that Ramaya just spoke about?
Sure. So, and thank you, Ramaya, for that much needed history and the context, which is important for how we frame our work too. Definitely an anti-capitalist framework that establishes a vision for the society that we deserve. And that informs a lot of the work that the Movement for Black Lives has done. So M4BL, the Movement for Black Lives, it's actually comprised of over 150 organizations around the country who have been really pushing for a lot of the drastic changes that need to happen across the board since Ferguson in 2014 and beyond. Also last summer, there were about 20 million people that were out in the streets protesting after the murder of George Floyd. And it's that uprising is really from years of work, and it happened because of the work of organizations on the ground, grassroots, community-based organizations that have been pushing for the changes that need to happen. And so what happened last year is that after or during the uprisings, there was sort of this rush to put legislation together at the federal level that was simply insufficient. It did not meet the demands of this moment. And so the Movement for Black Lives put together what is called the Breathe Act. And it is our response to what needs to happen as we push this country away from its history of police abuse, misconduct, and investments in in policing, the prison industry, really across the board. And so what the Breathe Act does is that the Movement for Black Lives uses this invest, divest frame. And what that means is we have to invest in the things that build strong communities, strong individuals, strong families. Those are the things that we all know off the top of our head. So housing, education, jobs, healthcare, all of the things that allow people to actualize their fullest potential and to live free, to be liberated. At the same time, we have to divest from the carceral state. And so when you think about what happens around this country, when we talk about policing, it's always investment in police infrastructure, police training, police equipment, or purchasing military equipment. Even if you look at the national level and think about how much we spend in the Department of Defense, trillions upon trillions of dollars, and yet we somehow are unable to pay to make sure that all of our people have access to healthcare. Trillions and trillions of dollars spent in the Department of Defense, and yet we can't seem to make sure that our public schools are adequately funded. That dynamic, the investment in the carceral state, we have to actively divest from that. And so we established that framework as the baseline for all of the policy that we developed with the Breathe Act. We have 4 major pillars that we've established for the Breathe Act that are about removing things like grants for police departments around the country, these grant programs that allow them to use these grants for different things, but they're grant programs essentially for police departments. We also are very strongly against things like police departments purchasing military equipment. And so we wanted to be really intentional about removing the funding for the things that we know will ultimately be harmful for communities. One thing that I've noticed in my work, particularly in Chicago, is when we talk about investments in community, it's interesting that the investments in the Black community and Black and Brown communities tend to be in the form of police infrastructure. So we have a new police training facility that's billed as economic development. That just goes to show how deep this notion of investing in police as the solution for all of our issues in the community goes. And it's what we are combating with the Breathe Act. And so we drafted this comprehensive legislation, and not only at the federal level to get it pushed, but we also have a strategy to push it at the state level across the country, recognizing that each state has its own set of bills, different legislation that's been drafted that claims to address the issue of police violence, but really does it in that very narrow sense. They talk about all of the things around policing, whether qualified immunity or banning chokeholds or no-knock warrants. We have the Justice and Policing Act that's now front and center, which focuses on that very limited lens. But we know that we have to expand that to talk about what the investments will be, how we will invest in our communities, how we will invest in mental health care, how we'll invest in the community-based organizations that are really at the front lines of this work, how we'll make sure that people can live healthy lives. That has to be a part of the legislation. And so our strategy is pushing this at the federal level, making sure that it is front and center as a priority, because it is the voices of all of the millions of people who made clear that they need and deserve a drastic departure from the status quo. And what we've had in the past has not worked and is woefully insufficient. And so we're doing that at the federal level. We're also doing it at the state level. We had a really exciting victory in Illinois a couple of weeks ago where they did pass the most comprehensive reform package in the state's history. And it was largely because of these so many coalitions that came together, grassroots community-based organizations who are against cash bail, who want to end prison gerrymandering, talking about pretrial fairness, and also about investments in community. They all came together, and we were able to align that legislation with the BREATHE Act, and it ended up getting passed in Illinois and signed by the governor a week ago. So there's momentum around it. And our priority is pushing this as aggressively as we can, because we know that this is the only legislation that meets the demands of this moment.
Thank you so much. And you mentioned the victory that Illinois had. And I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit more about the Movement for Black Lives campaign and policy strategies at the federal level, and how the state victories, I know that there's similar efforts. There's efforts underway in California and New York to pass similar legislation. How do you scale up these state victories and use them as a catalyst for national and federal support?
Sure. So the state victories, they give us momentum. They definitely give us momentum. And we also understand that each state is unique. So in different states, they have different components and pieces of legislation that have either been, the legislators have attempted to pass before, or they drafted and want to get passed. And so what's most important for us, especially for the Movement for Black Lives, is that yes, we have the federal legislation, we have our overall BREATHE package and what it entails. But even when we were engaging in Illinois, we understood that there were already organizations on ground who had been pushing to end cash bail for years. We knew that there were organizations on ground that had been pushing to end prison gerrymandering for a very long time. What we were able to do was we made it more robust because we have this invest frame, but we also were able to bring all of those coalitions together under one umbrella and push the kind of legislation that's the most comprehensive that the state has ever seen. And that's really important. It's about understanding the landscape before we engage at the state level, and then being able to add those layers and add that support so that we can get the buy-in of the communities that are being served, and also of the necessary elected officials. And that takes a little bit more hand-holding at the local level in each of these states. And it's why we rely on organizations that are a part of the Movement for Black Lives, because they are base building organizations, because they are the closest to the work. So it makes sure that our legislation actually reflects those voices. So we don't sort of develop our legislation over here, up here somewhere, and then say, hey, this is what you need. It's actually informed by the voices of folks who are closest to the work, doing it on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's how we were able to have traction. And that also helps us at the federal level, because when we're engaging a congressman or a congressperson or a senator, they know that their constituents have been involved in the drafting of this legislation and have a vested interest in it getting passed at the federal level. And that means a lot.
So that's pretty brilliant to me. So it sounds like you're saying that the infrastructure, a big component of it is this infrastructure at the local level that then you build upon, not reinventing the wheel, but adding to it and collaborating in order to scale it up to the state level in hopes of building that momentum nationally. So that can, Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's basically it. And it's definitely a collaborative process. But again, our belief is that policy is really a bottom-up process, and we want our policies to be relevant and to really meet people where they are. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of folks really getting behind BREATHE and pushing it, because it reflects what we've been pushing for so many years. And so they feel that resonance is what I think gives it more credence to other attempts to push reform legislation.
It's great. This is a great lesson. I just wanted to reiterate it because I think that's such a powerful lesson across movements, this kind of strategy in order to make truly responsive legislation, it has to start at that level, So thank you very much, Amara. Pleasure speaking to you. And you know, the nature of these sorts of Zoom events is that it's like one at a time. So, Alejandra. So, Alejandra, the Biden administration won over a lot of voters, like Leah mentioned, who were drawn to the Obama legacy. The immigrants' rights movement labeled Obama the deporter in chief because he deported more immigrants than any other president before him, and was part of the reason why ICE was so successful, because of collaboration with police. Can you talk about the connection between the over-policing of Black and Brown communities and ICE and the prospects for Black and Brown immigrants under the Biden administration now that the moratorium on deportations has been reversed?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Thanks, Amara, for all that information. The BREATHE Act is literally probably a piece of legislation that actually abolishes ICE. Plain and simple. I will be talking about a piece of legislation that doesn't really do that on its own. But as we're waiting to abolish ICE and getting people to support the BREATHE Act, I think this piece of federal legislation I'll be talking about really dismantles and deconstructs the way that they've been able to distort criminal justice laws and, like, you know, repurpose them for non-citizens and for immigrant purposes, for immigration purposes. So yeah, thank you. So I think when I hear people say, you know, that it's been reversed now, I'm like, you know, our communities really didn't see any change, right? I don't know how many people still got deported in those first 100 days, right? I think over 1,000 Black immigrants. We saw a lot of people talking about those planes, you know, those planes taking people from Haiti, right? And I think our communities basically didn't see that there was a stop on anything, right? I think sometimes policy conversations and language is so far away from, like, the actual things that are happening on the ground. So it just made me think of, like, all the people that ICE didn't let come home, right? All the people, the Department of Corrections, right? That use safety, right, to literally not release people who had release dates, let alone just because of COVID. And we know that COVID was going to keep spreading, you know, in the most, you know, unhumanized conditions. So I think, so I think for me, as part of the campaign, my own individual deportation case, we've seen, you know, from the learnings of Not More and More campaign, the learnings of Mi Gente, that it's really difficult to fight, you know, individual cases, particularly because of how the laws are due, particularly because laws tell a judge black and white that this person is mandatory detention or mandatory deportation, or a particular charge is under a substance 1 abuse, and that's automatic deportation as well. You start learning all of these things that body, all these legislations, all this policy work, and I'm just over here trying to fight my own case and not get deported, right? So I think, you know, the Keep Violent Free Deportation Defense Campaign is made up of homegirls that organize in their own communities and are using their skills, right, to support me and figure out how to keep me out of the ICE's way, basically, and the police's way, though. So this campaign was created out of crisis, but we keep moving forward together to keep sharing the stories, and also to document my navigation through the deportation pipeline. So I do serve as on the advisory board of the Immigrant Justice Network, which holds a lot of the work of the New Way Forward bill. And I say that because it's super important that, again, the people that mostly are impacted by policy that are also at the table having these conversations, right? So I'm just really blessed to have organizations that understand that communities need repair and restoration instead of further criminalization. So I'm really happy to be on the board of the Immigrant Justice Network that, again, has the New Way Forward. And the New Way Forward bill really is a piece of federal legislation that actually we know right now is a marker bill. It's an education bill to actually talk about what could really be when it comes to laws. Just as we created them, we can recreate them, or we can get rid of them, we can repeal them, right? And that takes people power. But the New Way Forward will end mandatory mandatory deportation and detention. It will end automatic deportation as well. It will bring people back. It will bring people back that, again, these immigration laws have harmed. It will also get rid of, 287G contracts, but we also understand that even though some communities might not have 287G, there's still police and ICE collaboration. So when there is police, there is going to be ICE. It's the same thing twice. We say that a lot, right? And I think what's been happening to criminalize Black communities is going to happen to everybody else, right? It's a new scapegoat. You know, those people that are in power to create what is illegal, define what is illegal, right? What's criminal activity? Those people actually creating that language and that rhetoric. It's going to be happening to other communities, right? So, you know, I understand that my liberation is tied to Black women and girls. And I think, you know, learning from the leadership of people at the Movement for Black Lives, for example, and being in collaboration and in cahoots with Black leaders is really important to us, because again, we're seeing and we're learning from what's already happening in the Black community. As long as there's police, there's going to be ICE, right? And there's going to keep being deportations and house transfers. So I think, again, this really ends any collaborations between also ICE and police at the local level. So the new way forward, we can send, I don't know if they put the link already there. But again, it's a really, really important piece of legislation that we're working right now. Chuy Garcia from Chicago sponsored it, along with folks from the squad. And I think it's super important, again, that we are also using cultural work and organizing and even celebrity-like people to talk about the new way forward, to talk about criminalization. We're in cahoots with a lot of people, again, working at those intersections. And it's really great to see, like, you know, a lot of influencers, a lot of like celebrities talk about it, because it's really complicated. I've been fighting deportation for 9 years now, and I still don't understand when people ask me, well, what are you appealing? I'll be like, oh, these 5 things, and like, you know, all this language. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a staff member at any of these organizations where I do this work daily, but I appreciate all these resources. I appreciate that I'm able to, like, you know, keep talking about this. So I also just wanted to say that what's happening locally, what's happening, you know, there's been attacks on immigrant activists like myself, right? Like, you know, I've been facing deportation for about 9 years, was incarcerated for 2 years in Eloy Detention Center, but came out was organizing from inside as well. But I really got, my story went viral when I got singled out and arrested by a Department of Homeland Security cop at a protest. And what we're seeing now in Arizona locally is also the fact that the police is using, like, just, you know, distorting laws and creating laws as we speak to also give, you know, protesters of BLM charges that convict them of like gang charges, right? Or inciting violence on the police. When again, we are critiquing state violence in our communities, critiquing ICE, right? For these deportation and the hunting of us, you know, on a day-to-day. So I think what we're really seeing is a moment to connect all of those things, right? And really understand that it's all interconnected. And I think at the policy level, it's super important for us to really like that's, it just really impacts, and it really allows these law enforcement to really go after you and throw away the keys in a sense, right? So I think what really this piece of legislation is going to do is give a little bit of justice back into the courts, if we want to talk about that. Because I just went to court, for example, on one of my last immigration reliefs, and the immigration court there looked into my face, even though we have shown years of, like, you know, transformation and rehabilitation letters, organizational, you know, packed courtroom over and over again, shown these like perfect packets for them, right? But we again show us that it's not about justice, it's about cleansing, right? This land is United States of people that look like me. And that judge looked at me and told me that I deserve what was happening, that he will not, you know, give me asylum because, you know, for me being deported to somewhere I haven't lived, right? Somewhere that I know the advocacy, the abortion work also that I do here is very criminalized, right? So I use that as an argument, and still he was like, no, you deserve to be there. You deserve your charges. Again, over, like, for example, a DUI that's over 10 years old, right? That I, again, have faced, you know, years of probation, you know, had to go back into an immigration detention. I'm getting deported for it. I'm, you know, multiple things, and I'm still fighting, right? Where white people just get a smack on the hand, or just, you know, have enough money to pay for it to go away. So again, I think it's a really important work, the policy work that we're doing. Again, which connects to, like, again, the attacks on abortion that are happening locally as well, right? So to me, it is the same fight, it's the same enemy. Locally, we're having, you know, legislation that's made up that gives, you know, your fetus, your eggs, more rights than we actually have as living, breathing people. So yeah, I just want to, I can cut it there. I don't know, we can add.
Thank you so much. No, I really appreciate how you highlighted the intersections between our different movements. And, there are so many different overlapping, fights that we're fighting or movements that we're building across Black and Brown communities, Black, Brown, Asian, and all communities of color. So I really appreciate that. And one thing that really resonated with me when we talked earlier is you talking about how your homegirls were the biggest support, like the foundation for the movement, for everything that you've done. And I just wonder, we have about a minute, if you can speak to that, about how like personal support helps you and builds your momentum.
Absolutely. Thank you. I was counting on you to ask me that. Absolutely. I always talk about there's this terms throwing out mutual aid. We've been doing that for so long. It's really true, right? The emotional support, the network of people that you build with and that have also a hand in your liberation, right? Like their liberation is also tied to yours. So yeah, for me, obviously with the support of all of these national organizations and their resources and their solidarity, sorry. That was my timer. Yeah, on a day-to-day basis, I have a network of about 8-9 homegirls that actually, use their skills, their solidarity, their, time to support me in my day-to-day stuff and organizing and all that. So even when today they're missing, but for example, when I would be on workshops like this, they'd get on to share resources, right? Maybe record or tweet from the campaign, because, we do a lot of our storytelling and advocacy, and we show that on our digital platform. So support like that, from just support even writing a grant, right? Like right now, trying to do this kind of storytelling cultural work is what's needed. We understand right now, especially in a moment of COVID. So a lot of that kind of work too. And a lot of the people already have, they've been defending people that have been in deportation proceedings. They're organizers, right? They're writers, they're part of other homes, and they bring their resources. So even running the website or the Action Network to send emails, from fundraising to actually creating events to lead workshops and bring our story out to anybody who wants to hear us. So I think I couldn't do that on my own. So I'm just really thankful for all these homegrown networks, again, because we're the ones always putting our bodies on the line. And the network goes from my own deportation case to the local abortion doula networks, where we have to give people rides because they're shutting down our clinics, right? So the same resources I get, I make sure that I'm sharing them out to people. So yeah, shout outs to all the organizers, right, that are part of people's individual cases. Sometimes it's really hard to do that work, and it seems like it's never ending. So I'm just really thankful for my homegirls.
Thank you so much. And yeah, that's a great frame, because often we feel like some people can feel very what can I do? But it starts in your community a lot of the time, and not organizing your community necessarily, but with the people around you. And that's how we scale up mutual liberation and this idea of shared prosperity. It doesn't have to be so abstract. Thank you so much, Alejandra. And Connie, thank you for joining us today. So 2020 made it. We all made it through 2020, but it made it very clear how critical public health infrastructure is in addressing public health crises. The United States, as we know, has the worst record in the world in terms of COVID fatalities, with Black, Indigenous, and communities of color hit the hardest. Can you discuss some of the key structural reasons why the healthcare system has failed us so disastrously amidst a global pandemic?
Yes, definitely. And I appreciate, Joelle, that you raise this as a structural issue, right? Because it is important to question the structure and the system that we're navigating. And I think because so many of us have actually experienced bias, sexism, and racism in healthcare, that we, tend to think about that as well. And so I just want to recognize we can only do so much on the ground and at the interpersonal level. So we really do have to analyze this at the structural level. We can't be cleaning this with a toothbrush. We need to take a big old street sweeper, right, to our healthcare system. And it's actually beyond semantics, right, or word choice between structural and interpersonal. And it's really key to our understanding of structural oppression and state-sanctioned violence within our healthcare system. And so what I would like to propose is that we stop normalizing and accepting this idea that we have a healthcare system, right? And recognize that we're actually surviving and navigating a harmful and murderous healthcare industry, right? I mean, you can only say that when you look at the numbers coming into the pandemic, right? So prior to COVID, 70 million people were unable to afford healthcare in the United States. 43% of people in the US were inadequately insured. We had disproportionate rates of underlying health conditions in communities of color. And we didn't have enough healthcare providers that actually, came from communities of color, right? So creating this industry that has failed our collective health so devastatingly in the pandemic, right? And this was really key to it. And this is because the industry is a business, right? And its primary goal is to make money. And I know that's an oversimplification, but it really is that simple. And that really is the problem, right? Is that this industry makes money when people get sick. And if you are founded and built on that, then where is the incentive to actually keep people healthy, right? So that means that you and I, we all have to actually buy our way in through health insurance, through publicly funded programs, or if you are lucky enough, wealth, right? Which so few of us can actually do. And so you've got to bring a large source of money with you if you want to access the healthcare system. So few of us have the bank accounts to actually support that, and otherwise we're excluded. And so that was what, that's what patriarchal racial capitalism looks like in our healthcare system. That's what we've been living with. People of color, women, people with disabilities, immigrants, right, are more likely to be excluded. And so all of this has been pent up over decades, right? And actually, while all of this was being built up, so has the power of corporations, right, to create monopolies. So beyond the simple business model of when somebody gets sick, we get paid, right? Corporations have done a lot to actually consolidate their power so they can have ultimate control and have monopolies, right? So they can say how much we need to pay if we want to access the healthcare system. For example, we have hospitals maybe in our communities, right? And so individual hospitals over decades have merged into what are called hospital systems, right? So they become part of these larger business conglomerates. So no matter which hospital a patient goes to, it profits the same corporation, right? And when corporations and industries eliminate competition, they get to determine, again, what price we pay, whether or not it's actually fair. And we've seen this happen also in the pharmaceutical industry, right? Where the price of medicine continues to go up every year. It's the same damn medicine, same formula, same dose, but we pay a higher price every year. And it's just because corporations own the market, and they can say, if you want this, then you need to pay up. Yeah, were you going to jump in, Joelle?
I was, because I wanted to ask how specifically the Healthcare for All campaign addresses those structural problems and interrogates the role of pharmaceutical monopolies within our current healthcare industry sort of realm.
Yeah. So excellent question. So in terms of Healthcare for All at People's Action, we are fighting for a long-term agenda, one that actually means that we actually have a functioning healthcare system, right, that meets the needs of people and not corporations. And so one of the biggest changes that we are fighting for right now is at the federal level, which is a Medicare for All system, right, where everybody has access to healthcare regardless of, citizenship status, income, all of those other things that are used to falsely divide up and make healthcare scarce. In terms of pharmaceutical monopolies, right? There are so many medicines that we need that are controlled by a monopoly. And so insulin is one example. A 3-month supply of insulin costs $3,700 in the US, and it costs $600 in Mexico. Right. So again, falsely inflated prices. And so we are actually calling for the government to dismantle pharmaceutical monopolies, right? Right now, the government has the power with the stroke of a pen. You don't have to pass a bill or any of the stuff that we've got to do for some of the other changes to make it so that no pharmaceutical corporation actually owns the right to a medicine that people need, right? And in COVID, we've seen Pfizer and Moderna, right, sort of hoard the recipe or hold the recipe for the COVID vaccine to them so that only they can make it and only they can profit from it. And that means we've had like a manufactured scarcity, right, at the ground level. And we've seen that play out in some really like racist ways, right, in terms of people who are wealthier or white, right, sort of overwhelm vaccination appointments and skip ahead of lines for vaccines that are intended for people of color in communities of color, right? And we've seen that play out on a global scale as well, where like pharmaceutical corporations are holding the recipe for the COVID vaccine to themselves. And so it has created a system where like, you know, we've been vaccinating people for months now here in the US. There are countries, 130 countries globally that have not had one vaccination, right? Have not delivered one shot in the arm to people in their country. That is a huge problem, and it's predominantly countries in the global South. For some of those countries, like people are not expected to actually get a vaccination until 2024.
I did not know that piece of information. Wow.
Yeah. And this is all to protect, again, pharmaceutical monopolies and profit. So I will pause there.
Right. So, yeah, so we see the profit motive in this capitalist structure has taken precedence over actually healing people, which really reiterates what I think all of you were saying, but also underscores the point that you made about rethinking our healthcare system and reframing it as just an industry that's trying to use regulatory capture and lobbying and all these things to hoard profit for themselves. And just real quickly, before we go into the all panelist questions, I would love to know what your campaign's demands and perspectives are around ensuring equitable access to the coronavirus vaccine.
Yeah, so, you know, our priority right now is to end the pandemic everywhere, right? We can't end the pandemic anywhere until we end it everywhere. It's sort of like an interesting sort of issue that we're facing. So Biden actually committed on the campaign trail to making sure that the US supports global cooperation, that the US supports this idea of sharing the COVID vaccine recipe, but he has not actually taken that position yet on the, you know, on the global stage. So there's this thing called the TRIPS waiver, right, which would basically temporarily waive you know, corporate rights to the vaccine recipe, which, by the way, was actually developed with taxpayer funding here in the United States. And so we technically should own that, right? And so we are pushing Biden and calling on him to actually deliver on his campaign commitment to support the TRIPS waiver so that people in the global South can actually make and get the COVID vaccine.
Great. And Emmy also put the link to the digital campaign in the chat box if anyone is interested in learning more. Thank you, everyone, for giving us a perspective on your individual work. I really appreciate it, or your individual work that you're leading and collaborating with others with, if that's more accurate. I do have a quick question for everybody who wants to answer, which is, can you discuss how the issues that you're focused on, policing, immigration, healthcare, COVID, things like that, especially impact women, trans, and non-binary people, given the fact that we're discussing this in the beginning of Women's History Month, and what the movements you're involved in can do to better center and prioritize women of color? So let's see, why don't I start with you, Connie, and then we'll work our way backwards.
Sure. So the question is how
How does your how does your issue area especially impact women, trans, and non-binary people? And what can the movements you're involved in do to better center and prioritize women of color, especially?
Great, thank you. Sorry, I had a momentary blip there.
That's fine.
So, I mean, I think one of the things that we can recognize in the pandemic is just like the compounded effect, right, of like that it has on us. And so in addition to like the public health threat of the COVID vaccine, the pandemic also adds another layer of threat to the health and safety of women, including trans women, worldwide, right? So globally, we've actually seen the rates of domestic violence in the COVID pandemic increase, right? As people are encouraged to stay home and shelter in place, it becomes an especially risky situation for women who are at constant exposure to their abusers. And I would say also the other thing to bring into this is the compounded effect of the economy, right? That and how it impacts women. So class has everything to do with our ability to actually remain healthy. And when you look at the numbers, right, like in January, 80% of all workers over the age of 20 who left the workforce were women, right? And Black and brown women's unemployment is even higher than the rate of white women's unemployment. So women of color are actually experiencing job loss at an even higher rate. And when you think of what that actually means, like it's not good. We've been through a recession before, right? In 2008, we had a financial crisis, and I think it took at least 10 years for Black women's employment to recover, right? And so this is a major setback. And so we have every interest in actually ensuring that the pandemic is contained because there are ripple effects that are devastating for women. I would also say, yeah, actually, I'll just stop there. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I know it's a big question and there's a lot of answers to it. So this is an exercise in, I don't know, prioritization, I guess. Alejandra, I'm wondering if you have any insights on how the immigration movement impacts women and non-binary people specifically, and how to center women of color more.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I can add a little bit. I mean, I think the fact that, again, that literally who you are is criminalized, right, is a huge problem. The fact that we criminalize migration, the fact that we demonize immigrants is a huge threat. So I think I think the best way for also folks to be able to prioritize, these, trans women, non-binary people is, again, to have a reproductive justice framework, right? To understand that this is holistic whole of a person. But at the end of the day, when we criminalize literally, the fact that you're criminalized for your body, in a sense, is illegal is a threat to that, So I think I think abolishing ICE is a first step, right? When we're talking about like getting to start defunding police as a whole. But again, I think once immigration is again used and weaponized against us, I mean, we're going to keep being criminalized point blank. I think the way that people can really center us is by paying attention to the decarceration movement, right? Paying attention to folks doing free them all work, paying attention to how they're criminalizing abortion and making those decisions of your full spectrum healthcare and interfering with that, right? Because of old biases, religious ideals, conservative ideals, hatred of people, right? The benefits of like keeping poverty alive. So I think those are the ways that people can better center folks, right? Because as far as policing and prisons existing, that's a threat to people's bodily autonomy, right? It's a threat to your reproduction, your sexuality, because police and cages are here to uphold that binary, right? That we work so hard to dismantle. That black and white, it takes, these immigration laws, which I didn't get to speak a lot about, but the reason why the federal legislation is even created is because it's dismantling the immigration laws of 1996, right? That really, combined criminal justice and immigration, and really, has made people illegal. So yeah, I think that's all I can add. And I think, being very wary again about this conversation now, I think in the Biden administration around immigration, they're using this new word called enforcement priorities. And I think instead of like now using that money to get more agents, they're shifting to like, surveillance and tech, which is still the same, is still as bad. So I think really like keeping an eye on that is going to be really, really important, especially because of the pandemic and people are getting more data because of the pandemic, and trying to support in that way that information is being funneled and given to law enforcement. So yeah, again, I can stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. And no rush, Amara, same question. Yeah, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so the movement for Black Lives, we're very intentional about using a Black queer feminist lens for all of the work that we do. And so that extends across the board. It extends to our climate agenda, to our education agenda, to our overall vision for Black lives, which we have posted on the website. And that's basically our policy agenda. It guides all of our work. And so we're really intentional about wanting everything that we put out into the world to reflect that Black queer feminist lens. As it relates to the Breathe Act specifically, we know there's so much of this that's related to particularly women of color, Black women. So when we talk about ending no-knock warrants, right? So much legislation is about banning no-knock warrants just in drug cases, but we can now think about Breonna Taylor, who till today, and one of so many, but Breonna Taylor is the name that comes to mind when we talk about ending no-knock warrants completely. Sandra Bland, I mean, these are ending cash bail, the fact that folks are sitting in jail just because they could not afford to pay to get out, where you have a system that prioritizes those who have money, it prioritizes the wealthy. And so we think of Sandra Bland's name comes to mind when we think of our push to end cash bail. But just thinking about Corinne Gaines, thinking about how, I mean, there's so many instances around the country of how Black women have really borne so much of the brunt of this country's obsession with incarceration, with policing. In Chicago, we had Rekia Boyd killed by a police officer, so many instances. And so we take all of that and it informs the kinds of policies that we craft. And it's part of the reason why we're so unequivocal in our push, why we're not content even to say reform. Like, no, I mean, it's the common term, the common terminology, but that's not what that's not our end game. It's not reform. I mean, the spectrum of this state as it is, and abolishing the prison, abolishing police, abolishing prisons, it's all part of this work of recognizing that there is a better society that we can build. And so even as as M4BL drafted this legislation, and it's really, we say we have this radical lens, but it's because we have a vision of a society where we are not destroyed and harmed by the systems that we live within, or the systems that we live under. And so that vision, we know is informed by our experiences, particularly as women of color, as Black women. And so it has to show up in the policies that we put forward. So that's how we make sure that what we're putting out there is specifically, I mean, if it benefits us, other folks will benefit, but we want to make sure that a Black queer feminist lens is sort of at the core of our work.
Absolutely, really appreciate that for so many reasons. And Ramaya, yeah, same question. Do you have anything to add about how censoring women works within, or censoring women and gender non-binary people, how your issue, censors them, and how you can better censor and prioritize women of color?
Yeah, so Black Swan Academy campaign is Police Free Schools and DC Girls Coalition and United Leagues for Freedom supported. So particularly talking about DC Girls Coalition, girls of color, non-binary people of color, and transgender are more often targeted for dress code violations by security and SROs than their counterparts. One of these reasons would like to, one of the reasons we would like to see is like police-free schools is to limit the attack on the young people's bodies by figures of authority. This will allow stopping adultification of girls of color, non-binary people of color, and transgender girls of color. So honestly, this is, like I mentioned before in the beginning, it's basically a distraction of someone's education or depriving them from even learning. If you have to, assume that me as a black black girl, um, I look too mature and I need to go home and change, even just because of how my body is shaped. I'm trying to come here and learn. I God made me this way, and that goes for all other girls, non-binary people, and transgender people. They change. They wear what represents them, and they're shaped the way God created them. So um you can't say, oh, they're acting mature, or like assume they're trying to be adult like because of what they're wearing and how their body is represented through the clothes, because clothes is just fabric. Fabric takes different forms depending on the person. So that's for everybody. If adults look different, just people just develop differently, and just the society needs to understand that and stop using it as a tactic to deprive students of color, girls of color, non-binary people of color, transgendered people of color from even getting the chance to learn.
Thank you so much. Yeah, like I didn't even think of that aspect of it, that sort of like paternalistic aspect that criminalizes young women, and especially young women of color, in a way that we don't see across the board. So thank you for speaking to that. And I really do appreciate everybody's presence on this panel. And at this time, we are going to pass it over to my esteemed colleague Leah to talk about some Q&As that we received in the chat and from Facebook. And once again, thank you to our panelists.
Cool. Thanks so much, Joelle. I'm so energized by this discussion and appreciate all of you and all of your responses. So we have a question that I wanted to pose to all of you, and we have just enough time for everyone to make this your last response. So we can close on this. And I was just ask you, because there's 4 of you, to just please keep it short, like a minute and a half. So we know that the new administration will not deliver on everything our communities need. And Amara, you were, talking about this, right? Like reform is not the end game. So my question to you is to leave the audience with today. What are your non-negotiables? What is your end game? That's the question to leave the event with. And why don't we go in the other way? So we can start with Ramaya, and Connie will take us home.
Okay, so well, since we were talking particularly to the Biden administration, all of my ideas kind of like could be similar to advocated towards the president and his administration, but I never even thought about it in that way. But here's some of the things I have been thinking about: more interaction and the opportunity for communities to define how tax dollars are spent, restructure of current tax system, a revision. This idea I always had, like since I've been learning about capitalism and the economy, is a revision of the Constitution. And I have examples to explain why I think this idea should be put forth to action. Addressing the different events during and after slavery that currently impact our current society, the Constitution should actively create ways to protect African American and specifically identify and state those new laws and particularly related to police brutality. Of course, police-free schools across the country. One more thing I would like to add, and I will try to run. I think the government should take a different approach. Members of societies, communities should determine what and how government should enforce new policies, laws, and create services. The government should listen to the voices of people of all races, ethnicities, genders, and age groups to get the best possible solution they can provide citizens with. Essentially, I'm proposing that citizens of the country should lay out the plan of what they want to see in their communities. The only role the government should play is taking the recommendations of everyone within the communities and making sure when they are writing these new policies, laws, or create services, it reflects, if not all, at least most of the recommendations presented in a sustainable way. I think this would be a good step. And lastly, it has to be accountability um, for actions among people of color, African Americans, of the struggle they have endured and how much, in the past we have been fighting and currently still fighting for the same issues. I'm gonna make this quick because I feel like I'm being long. Make it quick. I was in class in my writing and composition class, and my professor, he gave us a scenario, and he said if he was to ask us if he was to ask us to read the Pledge of Allegiance or even had it in the syllable, will we support it or not? And my initial answer was no. And I had to explain why. And my reason was that that I don't believe in pledging to a country that people like me have struggled since the day they were brought here. They were taken actually from their native land and brought here to land that was stolen because it wasn't discovered, it was stolen. And I don't believe in pledging to a flag that don't even respect me, because I'm still currently seeing replications of old events that happened a long time ago. Not even just a long time ago, even like just 40 years ago. One example I'll say is Rodney King. Even though he did not die in his situation, his case, the officers got acquitted for what they done to him. And I'm just hoping that it's not the same case for George Floyd as we look at the trial of George Floyd. And it's just like repeatedly over the years, just police brutality. You want to put drugs in communities of color to keep them in poverty, and then expect them to find a way to make the American dream, which is not real if you already set ground rules going back to the Constitution, foundation of this country, to keep African Americans and other people of color in poverty. Like it just doesn't make sense. So I'll end here because of time, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Ramaya. Amara?
Yeah, so I guess just quickly, what I would say is the end goal, one, is to not settle, to not believe that we have to settle or that we have to sort of dial back our demands. I think for so long, this sort of preference for compromising and kind of going along with the status quo seems to, for a lot of people, that's the way to go. And I just think that we have a moment where we need to actually put our foot on the gas and be even more aggressive and accelerate these pushes that we have in all of our spheres with the same boldness as the opposition. I mean, they never hesitate to do whatever they're doing. And so I just think we need to meet that and actually surpass it. And then the second thing that I would say, as far as the end goal for me, it's not so much what the end goal is, it's just a caution that we not become complacent or led to believe that diversifying imperialism is acceptable, meaning that this administration in particular has been beating this drum of how diverse the cabinet appointees are, how diverse these different positions that need to be filled are. And, we just can't afford symbolism. We need substance. And frankly speaking, I don't care what race the person is, if their politic is not aligned, if their stances do not change the material conditions of our communities, then it's not a win for us. And so my caution is that we don't accept that we're not assuaged by a rainbow coalition of imperialists or a rainbow coalition of oppression. We still have to keep our eye on the ball and not get distracted because, the people who are driving these processes look like us. If anything, it should make us more cautious and more committed to getting substantive, tangible changes for our community. I would say that's an end that I'm looking toward, but it's also a caution for us as we move forward with this new administration.
Thanks, Amara. I appreciate the perspective and tend to agree. Alejandra?
Yeah, I think I think since we inherited this racially biased criminal system, I think for me, the vision is to never anything without us for us, right? Like when we talk about the 11 million, have had interactions with the police, right? Have had interactions one way or another, been harmed by family separation due to the police, to state violence. So I think for me, it's again, like we're never gonna win anything if we're not organizing the rest of the 11 million, right? So, I don't think I can really add anything else besides that to really make sure that the people are at the forefront, again, that the leadership of people who felt have felt the impacts of the intersections of immigration and criminal justice are at the table, right? And that we need to stop throwing people under the bus. It's a moment where we all understand that there is a crisis, right? That the justice system is a farce. And I think, we have to just fight, for a more just world and to decarcerate until abolition.
Great. Thanks, Alejandra. Connie?
Endgame would be to win a feminist future, right? And I want to uplift sort of like the global or internationalist perspective in this, right? So Biden really needs to do something to end US imperialism, right? Affirm is centering the leadership of women of color who have transnational history. So we are very much in touch with what is happening nationally. Just want to lift up that globally, women and people in feminized labor are migrating from their homelands because of economic devastation at the hands of the US, right? And so they're like in COVID, we've seen a diaspora of Filipino healthcare workers around the world who are caring for the rest of the world's population in order to make ends meet back at home. That is a problem, right? In California, we have 1 in 4 nurses who are Filipino. And so that means that we have actually had 3 to 4 times more Filipino healthcare workers die in the US than in the Philippines. How does that actually make sense, right? And so I also just, as we close out, want to lift up the incredible work of our transnational committee at Affirm, who recently saw this issue and built a data wall and digital memorial to compile the stats and stories of Filipino healthcare workers. We're basically outlining the problem so that we can correct this and put ourselves on a path towards actually building a feminist future. So thank you. Oh, and that website, sorry, can I just say that website is called Kanlungan. It's very important. And yeah, hopefully the links will go in the chat so folks can visit and honor those who have fallen but have not even been named. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Connie. Yes, thanks for lifting that up there. It is in the chat along with links and hashtags and the like from all of our panelists who talked about all of their campaigns. So I just want to thank all of our incredibly powerful panelists who joined today. Thank you so much. And our audience who joined. One quick announcement, Race Forward is excited to announce our fall Race and Our Present, Our Future, which is a half-day event focused on centering the solutions-driven racial justice movement-making work of Black and Indigenous youth and young adults ages 13 to 25. And Race Forward hopes to use this platform to create an intergenerational dialogue that highlights the critical role youth organizing takes in the movement towards racial equity. So please sign up at Race Forward to receive the save the date for the event by visiting raceforward.org. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great rest of your evening.